In early 1920, a woman by the name of Boxcar Iva was captured by the Red Army in Russia. Now, at the time, Russia was going through a civil war. So, of course, you had the Bolsheviks, who were led by guys like Trotsky and Lenin, and they were trying to set up a communist society, which would eventually win out, of course, and become the Soviet Union. Now, these guys in the Red Army were going up against what was known as the Whites, or the White Army. And this was kind of a mixture of people who supported the old government, people who wanted a more traditional style of government, and then basically foreign influences like the United States, Great Britain. Now, Boxcar Iva was captured in 1920, interrogated for 4 months in a Russian jail. And I think anyone who knows anything about Soviet interrogation techniques knows that's not exactly the place you want to be. So after 4 months of Soviet interrogation, Boxcar Iva was deemed an enemy of the Socialist Republic. And then she was brought into a room, told to kneel down, and was summarily shot and executed by a Soviet execution squad. Keep in mind, this is 1920 in Russia. Okay, so this is not a time period where women held a lot of power or importance in general in the grand scheme of world politics and world events. Now, how could a woman generate so much animosity from the state and so much distaste that they would go about executing her? Now, in order to understand kind of the full context of this story, we need to look at her life and kind of how things led to this. So this story is a sad story. It's an interesting story. And it also has parallels for the modern day. So this is the story of the Russian woman's Battalion of Death. The Russian Women's Battalion of Death is ultimately a story about a bunch of women in Russia, some young, some old, from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different jobs, different classes, all coming together and fighting in World War I, and actually, by all accounts, fighting incredibly well, admirably, and even at times successfully. So it's simultaneously a story that's uplifting and kind of shows elements of a group of society that's able to rise up and become something more than they were, and it's also got elements of sadness and tragedy to it as well, which we'll get into. Now, in order to understand the story, you really have to understand a little bit about World War I. Okay, so just some context. A lot of people come up when they hear I'm into history, maybe whether it's students or adults or whoever, they say, hey, what's the most interesting thing to you in history? What's your favorite, event in world history? And pretty much all the time I'll tell them World War I. Okay, and here's why. To me, history is interesting for two reasons. Okay, reason number one is those stories of, fantastical elements, human emotion, human courage and sacrifice and all those things. And World War I has more of that than perhaps anything I've read, because it's, first of all, is one of the first wars where we start getting people writing down a whole lot of their experiences in the trenches, and we have a lot of accounts, both of soldiers in the battle and people outside the battle. It has that element of it where we can understand the human emotion. Now, the second reason history is interesting to me is because of that old classic idea of, in order to understand the present, you need to understand the past. You don't want to make the same mistakes or repeat the mistakes of history, right? So a lot of people think that's why history is important. Whether or not that's true, a lot of people who suddenly get into politics or get into current events or get into history, they want to understand how we got to this place, this kind of crazy place in society we're in. And if you ask me, you need to look back to World War I. That's kind of where all this started. So looking at World War I provides a lens through which we can understand the present. Almost all of the problems in today's society are actually a direct result of World War I. So that's probably an episode of the podcast we'll do later on where we talk about all the impacts of World War I. But for now, it's important to understand that World War I was a world-changing conflict. This war got started, there was kind of an unhealthy mix of militarism, nationalism, a desire to basically promote national interests as opposed to kind of international cooperation in Europe, and this was kind of rising. We had rivalries between countries. We had military buildups which were significant, and of course we have rising nationalism, both inside and within countries and between countries. And what I mean by that is that you have different ethnic groups inside of a country trying to compete with each other, trying to get their own perhaps nationhood or more rights or whatever the case may be. And then you also have nationalism on like a countrywide level where it's kind of like, us British were better than the Germans, or, we Germans were better than the French. We want to prove it, whatever the case may be. Obviously, that's a simplistic take on it. Now, basically, militarism, nationalism, and competition creates a powder keg, which gets Europe in a position where it's ready to explode. And the person who does that goes by the name of Gavrilo Princip. He assassinates Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and all of a sudden, war breaks out. All right, so Russia gets involved in the war. They're on the side of Great Britain and France. And then, of course, it's Germany, Austria-Hungary, and basically the Ottoman Empire. And Italy kind of flip-flops back and forth throughout the war. And there's other elements of the war and other countries that get involved, but those are the main players, at least at the beginning of the war. Russia gets involved in the war. They have what's known as an autocratic regime. They were ruled by a czar. He was basically like the king of Russia. He was in charge of everything. And he kind of ran a fairly brutal regime. And he sends the country into the war. And now, of course, Russia sees itself battling for what many considered their very existence. So whether or not this was a propaganda thing or whether it was just classic governments trying to, rally their people together to go fight, they saw the German threat as hugely significant to the future of Russia even existing. So Russia gets involved in the war, and as has been well documented and kind of most accounts agree, they just didn't do well in this war at all. So they took forever to mobilize. They lost a lot of men, ordered a lot of offensives and charges that were unsuccessful. That didn't mean they didn't have operations that were successful, at least to an extent, including the Brusilov offensive. But by and large, the war was a disaster for Russia. Okay, they were losing millions of men. They didn't have the equipment necessary to fight in this new modern war. And all in all, it didn't work out well for Russia. Okay, so there's that kind of old story about Russia sending 2 men into World War I, and then as soon as the first guy dies, the guy behind him, because he doesn't have any equipment, he goes and picks up the machine gun and then continues to fight. So whether or not that's true or not, the point of the story is to show that Russia was just not prepared for this war, and it was a disaster. So that war starts in 1914, and by the time 1917 rolls around, okay, Russia's in dire straits. All right, so historian Brian Krim says that, quote, "There's a direct correlation between political anarchy and social chaos," end quote. All right, so I think what he means by that is that Russia was in dire straits in 1917. People were losing faith in the government, and ultimately that government was going to get overthrown and replaced by a more moderate provisional government, of course, with a lot of Soviet and communist influence. All right, so when all that's happening, this political chaos is happening, now all of a sudden we have the ingredients for social chaos, and we have the ingredients for what a lot of people saw as, craziness. Some people didn't, and that is basically women fighting in war. All right, so Women have been fighting in Russian societies for a surprisingly large amount of times. They were called ancient women's Amazons. 2,500 years ago, there's stories of Russian women fighting in battles. There's stories of heroes that were women going into the Napoleonic Wars, some even rising to the ranks of officers. So there is a history of women in Russia fighting in war. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's a history of any organized units of women fighting together. Okay, so there were individual women who maybe snuck into the army or somehow got involved, but we didn't see any units entirely based of women fighting in the war or in any war. So this war, World War I, and the Women's Battalion of Death, that's going to be the first time we see that. This movement was very popular at the time. Okay, so a lot of women were getting involved. Stories were written about it in the newspapers. People in the West were reading about it. People in the East were reading about it. And everyone had a different opinion. All right, so some people thought this is a progressive movement for women to be able to, enter the public sphere and get involved in something that, traditionally is seen as a male-dominated thing, which is warfare. All right, so clearly, for a lot of people, this Women's Battalion of Death and this entry of women into the war was a positive thing for the feminism and the progressive movement. Now, as much as that was the case, there was also an opposite reaction, which was women need to maintain their traditional gender roles. Okay, they need to maintain their domestic duties, and this is wrong. Okay, and what we see is that people from all different sides of life and all different social classes are going to disagree, and there's going to be a big conflict over this, which we'll get into. Ultimately, World War I was known as a total war. 36% of the Russian population went to war in Russia. All right, and most of those are males, obviously. Women are going to make up 50% of the labor force, and they're going to be forced to kind of go into the factories and do some of the jobs that men were doing before that now they can't do because they were at war. So when we say World War I is a total war, not only do we mean it was modern in terms of its scale and destruction and devastation, but we also mean that it was a total war in that not only was there a battle going on in the trenches, but there's a battle going on the home front in order to produce the materials and kind of produce the support that those armies need. So everyone had to be involved. This includes women. And some of these women, the women that go into the Russian Women's Battalion of Death, they're going to put that to the test. Was World War I a total war? We're about to find out. Between 1914 and 1917, before the formation of official women's military formations and units, what we saw was that individual women soldiers were going in and basically disguising themselves as men and then getting involved in the war that way. So they would disguise themselves as male soldiers, cut off their hair, put on male clothing, start acting like a little more masculine, maybe a little bit more spitting, a little more cursing, and they would get in these military formations and they would fight in the war. This was one way that women contributed to the war effort. The more traditional way of contributing to the war effort was what was known as the Sisters of Mercy. Okay, so these were women who a lot of times would be nurses, or they would report on the rear lines of the battle and basically provide support. They wouldn't provide any direct combat. So these Sisters of Mercy played a significant role in a lot of battles as far as helping the wounded and supporting men that way. Now, eventually, some of these women, some who were Sisters of Mercy and some who weren't, they wanted to have a more direct role. So they would disguise themselves as males. They would get involved in, male military formations, and they would go and fight. So why do these women do this? Well, it's difficult to understand from the modern perspective, but basically the answer is patriotism. Okay, these women were so patriotic, and they wanted to basically go on a patriotic adventure for their countries, and they wanted to be able to participate in the war just like men could. Okay, so some of these women were, 15-year-old schoolgirls. Some of them were 40-year-old peasant wives who've got 10 children. Okay, so it's tough to think about how in modern day America, maybe getting 15-year-old girls to care about anything, much less a war. But it's just a different time, and it shows you the nationalism of the time and the patriotism of the time and kind of how much it meant to people. I'll share a couple stories with you about how these individual women soldiers got involved in this fighting, kind of how and why they got involved and what they did. So there's a wide variety of stories and kind of tales from these individual women soldiers who fought in this war between 1914 and 1917. The first two kind of show how women were able to contribute to the fighting. They were able to be very brave and productive and also demonstrate a crazy amount of toughness. So the first one, there was a Cossack woman. The Cossacks are a group of people in Russia, usually very good on horseback. Most of them come from military families. Okay, so this Cossack woman gets on her horse. She demonstrates how great she is on horseback. She gets admitted into a cavalry unit for the Russians. They get into a skirmish with the Germans. This woman, performs admirably in battle, but gets shot in the head. And instead of immediately getting treatment, she refuses medical treatment until she can basically report all the reconnaissance information that she had been scouting. So a great example of Russian toughness right there. The next story is a woman who snuck into a regiment, basically posing as a man. She cut off her hair and she dressed like a man and was able to go through undetected. Her unit gets captured by Germans and they're being stored in a barn, basically. She, being kind of the smallest one of the unit, is the only one who's able to sneak out of this window, and that's exactly what she does. She sneaks out the window, kills a German sentry, captures the rest of the unit, and then frees her unit that had been in the barn. So, two great examples of just the crazy amount of toughness and ingenuity that some of these women soldiers showed. Now, it wasn't always sunshine and rainbows. Okay, so a lot of these women would get to the battlefield and then they would break down. Okay, so there's a story of a Georgian princess. Her name was Katie, and she was kind of swept up in the patriotism and the gung-ho attitude towards war. And she gets to the battle lines and she kind of realizes what this war is all about. Okay, so by the way, what this war is very simply, basically it's called trench warfare. Okay, so both sides would build a trench. The distance between the two trenches could be anywhere from a couple hundred yards to less than that to even more than that. So it really depended on the situation. While you were in that trench, you were kind of holding your line and you were preventing any sort of charges or movement from the enemy, and you had to live in that trench. Okay, so while you were simultaneously repelling charges from the enemy and then charging, trying to capture their trench yourself, you were also living in that trench in order to defend it 24/7. So you were constantly under gunfire, you were constantly under artillery fire, and you were constantly living in what was just crappy conditions. Okay, rain, mud, artillery shells coming at you 24/7, gunfire, and rats as big as cats. Okay, so not the best scenario for mental health. So a lot of these women did get to the battlefield, and once they kind of realized what was happening and what actual warfare looked like in this modern war, they kind of realized their mistake. Now, I'm not sure that's a woman thing at all. That's not the point I'm trying to make. I think that's just the horrors of World War I thing. So that was happening to men and women, by the way. So a lot of both men and women were okay with the gunfire and the bombs and the killing of the enemy, the violence aspect of it. But what really got to them and what really turned them mentally kind of unhinged was the everyday aspect of living in those trenches. So the rats, okay, the feces, sleeping in the mud, the wet feet, the trench foot, okay, the rain, all that stuff was what ultimately kind of made these people snap. And if you read the accounts, a lot of times that's what you'll see. For my money, the saddest story of these individual women soldiers getting involved was a group of schoolgirls between the age of 14 and 17. And I guess they just made a pact due to patriotism, and they wanted to go out and help their country. And these girls basically just joined up with a group as they were marching towards the battlefront. So they were enabled by a lot of men who kind of allowed them to join the unit, and actually ended up trying to do their best to protect them. But it's still kind of a sad story because they didn't tell their parents. And, the administration, the government wasn't exactly firing on all cylinders in Russia at the time. So a lot of these girls were able to slip through the cracks. They went and kind of fought in a supporting role and even made it to the trenches, where some of them actually were killed. So it's a very sad story, and it's really shows the dangers of patriotism, and kind of that these girls wanted to escape their kind of normal mundane lives and go on and do something more powerful and more valuable to their country. So it shows the elements of patriotism and nationalism that really got this war started. What we end up seeing in Russia is that stories like this start popping up all over the place. Okay, so women are getting involved in these wars. They're being discovered. And first of all, how did that go? A lot of times, it wasn't as bad as you would think. A lot of men who discovered women serving in their units would either A, show them to the officers, and the officers sometimes let them stay because they were good, productive soldiers, or sometimes just said, hey, just go home. A lot of times there wasn't any sort of punishment, even though that behavior was illegal. And a lot of men actually, even after they found out that these soldiers were women, they continued to kind of try and protect them and even looked after them even more. Okay, so that was seemingly the vast majority of the cases of these women who were discovered. As this was happening, more and more people were discovering that these women soldiers were getting involved in the war. There was a bigger desire for women to get involved, and they started going to the government, basically with these grassroots organizations trying to get together actual women's units. So not just individual soldiers, women sneaking in to the battle lines, but more of let's get a whole unit of women together and kind of see what we can do. And that's how the Russian Battalion of Death was formed. So what you have in Russia by the time 1917 rolls around is a completely explosive situation that's ready to blow up and become a disaster. And ultimately that's what ends up happening. So what you have is women trying to enter the battle. They're trying to promote bigger access to the public sphere for them. You have a country that's been involved in World War I for several years now, and that's led to millions and millions of people dying, being wounded in battle, permanently psychologically scarred. Okay, all the negative effects of that war are really crippling the society. Okay, you add in the fact that the government is seen as weak, ineffective, also at times brutal and oppressive, and you have the recipe for political revolution. Okay, and that's exactly what happens. So in February 1917, what starts as a basically National Women's Day march towards the Tsar's palace in Russia ends up gathering more and more protesters. All of a sudden you have violence breaking out, and you have people marching on the Tsar's palace at the capital, and ultimately the Tsar just says, you know what, peace out, I'm out of here. Okay, so he's going to abdicate the throne, and that's basically the end of 300 years of Tsarist rule in Russia. Okay, now after this, what is put in its place is known as the Provisional Government. Okay, so the Provisional Government is led by a guy named Alexander Kerensky, and Kerensky is kind of in charge of piecing together all these different elements in the politics of Russia at the time. Okay, so on the one half of this provisional government, you have people who support social democracy, and these people include a mix of people who kind of supported the Tsar before, more conservative folks, also people who are liberals, want to see more democracy, more rights for everybody, etc., that type of deal. And then on the other side, you have a growing group of people known as the Bolsheviks. Okay, and these guys are communists. They are a little bit more radical, obviously, and they're actually growing in power and growing in influence. Now, Kerensky's kind of trying to balance the Bolsheviks with the more moderate elements of the provisional government, but ultimately that's what makes up that provisional government. The big issue at the time, of course, is World War I. Okay, so now that the Tsar is out of the picture, the question for the provisional government is, should Russia stay in the war or not? Okay, millions and millions of people are dying in the war, and ultimately it's decision time. Okay, so what ends up happening is the provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, they want to stay in the war, and they keep Russia in the war. Now, the Bolsheviks, they, being communists, usually do not support this war of imperialism. They see it as a war for power and influence, and it's not their thing. Okay, so the Bolsheviks want to stay out of the war, and Kerensky and the provisional government wants to stay in the war. Basically, it's desperation time. Okay, they've been getting crushed. Russia's not doing well in the war at all. Okay, the Germans are basically doing a lot of damage to them all across the Eastern Front. And the Russians think that they need to kind of make one last big punch. Okay, one last epic kind of blow that will ultimately turn the tides in their favor. In their desperation, the Russians do all sorts of crazy things. The things that the Russian government, this provisional government, is going to do as this kind of one last desperation move, these things are going to run the gamut from aggressive military operations to propaganda techniques, okay, to social reform measures. It's going to be a whole gamut of just different avenues that the provisional government is going to take. One of the things they do, which is definitely, at least in my opinion, a little bit messed up, is that there was this view that the reason Russia was not doing well in the war, first of all, was because the Tsar and the Tsarist government was inefficient and they were running things terribly. And the other view was that the soldiers in Russia were not patriotic enough. Okay, they were not fighting hard enough for their country. They were not demonstrating as much patriotism as they should. Now, this might seem self-defeating because why would you want to upset the soldiers who are fighting for your country? But they thought that by pointing this out, that would kind of raise the level of patriotism, raise the level of effectiveness of the troops, and force them to fight harder. Okay, so one of the things they did was they got together military units of disabled veterans. Okay, so disabled veterans, and they were going to go to the front, and the goal of this unit was to kind of shame the soldiers as if to say, look, we can get these guys who are already fought and they're already disabled and they've already given everything for their country. Now we're going to bring them back and we're going to make you feel bad because you're not fighting hard. Okay, so that's one of the things the Russians did. Now, the other thing that the provisional government is going to do is they're going to start organizing these women's units. Okay, so as we said, there was more and more demand for women entering the battle, and there's more and more demand for women to form their own units. So what ends up happening is these grassroots organizations start approaching the government, and eventually they reach a deal where they're going to have these women's units, and they're going to be totally run by women, and they're going to put them on the battlefield. Now, for the women, a lot of these women, again, they were fighting for patriotic reasons. Some were feminists. Okay, some just wanted to prove that women had a place in the public sphere. Okay, by the way, women got the right to vote in Russia in 1917. So they wanted to continue proving that women could do this. A lot of women were just escaping their everyday mundane lives that they didn't enjoy. All right, so there's a variety of mixture of reasons why women got involved. So the key to that would be the patriotism reason, I would say. Why did the government allow this to happen? Well, you got to remember that this was part of that one last desperation move, that one last offensive. And the idea was we're going to put together these women's units and we're going to show the rest of our male soldiers who make up the vast, vast majority of our army. We're going to show them what it takes to win this war. So the idea was to kind of shame those men into having a further sense of patriotism, as if to say, look, you guys have been screwing this thing up for the last 4 years. We have to bring in women to clean up your mess. Okay, that's how bad things are. You should feel ashamed of yourself. Now let's go fix it. All right, so the idea behind this Women's Battalion of Death from the government side was a propaganda tool. Okay, they were going to be a tool to hopefully try and inspire the troops, and if that meant shaming them a little bit, then that was the case. So the provisional government did not view these women's units as the mainstays of any sort of significant fighting force. It was mainly for a propaganda technique. Now, that the woman actually fighting in the units, okay, it's a totally different story. As we'll see, a lot of them, were proving something to themselves, and they actually wanted to get involved in the war for reasons that were not propaganda. The woman that they select to be the leader of this women's battalion of death is a woman named Maria Boxcar Iva, and she's kind of probably the central figure of this story. And it's only taken me 30 minutes to get to her, but we're going to ignore that for now. Now, Boxcar Iva was one of those women soldiers who went into the war in disguise. She cut off her hair. Okay, she dressed like a man. She acted like a man. She spat a lot. All the accounts say she was cussing a lot and just kind of a very crass and kind of brutal woman who kind of subverted those typical gender roles where you might think of a woman as supposed to be prim and proper and clean. Not necessarily the case with Boxcar Iva. She was very crass, very kind of masculine. She grew up as a kid, and her father was abusive to her, was probably an alcoholic, so she ran away from home with her boyfriend then at the time, and it turns out he also turned out to be abusive and alcoholic, so she got kind of caught in this cycle of just terrible relationships, alcoholism, abuse, and she saw joining up in the military as a way to escape basically her crappy life. So that was kind of her main motivation to join into the army. Now, once she was there, she actually gained respect, okay, from her male counterparts. Okay, so eventually it was determined that she was a woman. Her particular commander didn't seem to care that much. She let her continue to do what she was doing, and eventually she gained command of a small group of about 10 soldiers, and by all accounts, she did a good job. The soldiers respected her, and everything was fine from a military perspective. Boxcar Iva was pretty clearly the best choice to lead this women's battalion of death. Here's Maria Boxcar Iva on why she wanted to be the leader of this women's battalion of death. Okay, so according to her, quote, "I've decided to form a women's battalion of death, to create real women soldiers and to go with them to the front. It must serve to shame those male deserters who, on the eve of final victory over the enemy, run away from their civic duty. And so, comrades, I call upon you to join my battalion." End quote. Now, this quote kind of, again, shows that how these women's battalions of death were a propaganda technique in order to shame men. So, from the government perspective, these women were doing this in order to shame the men into doing a better job fighting, and this was okay with Boxcar Iva. Boxcar Iva was a extremely harsh disciplinarian. Okay, almost imagine your typical drill sergeant. She had incredible discipline in her unit, and she wanted to get this women's battalion of death up and running, and she wanted to be a legit military formation, which it ended up becoming. So here's an excerpt from historian Lori Stoff, her book on this women's battalion of death, and she also talks about the other women soldiers fighting in Russia in World War I. So here's an excerpt from that book from Lori Stoff, who says, quote, "Boxcar Iva insisted upon maintaining the strictest possible discipline in the unit and subjected her volunteers to a stringent training regimen and a Spartan military lifestyle. The recruits were required to rise at 5 a.m., engage in morning prayers, and eat a simple breakfast of tea and bread. They drilled intensively until 11 a.m. when they broke for the midday meal, and then they continued training until 9 p.m. They slept on bare boards, on metal cots, covered only by thin bed sheets. Their daily training consisted of strenuous physical exercises, marching drills, hand-to-hand combat practice, and most importantly, rifle training. Boxcar Iva personally supervised nearly every aspect of the military instruction and kept a close eye on the women's conduct at all times. She was intent upon transforming the volunteers into capable warriors." Here's a quote from Boxcar Iva. "I will make strong those of you from the weaker sex. Forget that you are women, you are now soldiers." End quote. So this quote from historian Lori Stoff, who just does a good job summarizing Boxcar Iva's personality there, shows how tough she is, shows how hard she is, shows how much she values discipline. And the other key thing there is that Boxcar Iva is not one of these feminist women looking to allow women a greater access to the public sphere and all that stuff. She's not one of those people. Okay, she thinks that women are actually indeed the weaker sex. Okay, so she wants to masculinize, essentially, I'm not sure if that's a word or not, but she wants to make her unit more masculine. Okay, so she sees the woman as being a weaker sex, and she needs to kind of drill that out of them. So any woman in this women's battalion of death who exhibit any sort of feminine aspects or gender roles that would typically be ascribed to women, they're basically going to be removed from the unit, or that's going to be drilled out of them. Okay, so Boxcar Iva was very much trying to make this military unit as basically as manly as possible, if that makes any sense. Okay, and she would accomplish this through a variety of techniques, including forcing them to wear men's clothing, shaving their heads, so they had buzz cut style hair. If you look at the pictures, you can Google Women's Battalion of Death, you'll see they all have buzz cuts. They all are wearing men's clothing, and this is some of the ways that Boxcar Iva was able to get that feminine aspect of things out of the picture. Okay, and this was what she believed. So who joined this Women's Battalion of Death? Well, it was a wide variety of people, okay, a wide variety of women. So a lot of the soldiers, women soldiers who had already joined the war and were already fighting, okay, they were removed from their units and ended up joining this Women's Battalion of Death. Okay, that only makes sense. But also women from all aspects of life volunteered until there were literally thousands of women volunteering. Okay, so you had doctors, you had lawyers, you had peasants, you had bankers, okay, you had upper class, you had middle class, you had lower class. Okay, but in general, these women were between 18 and 35 years old. 50% of them, okay, had a secondary education, so 50% were relatively well educated in 1917 Russia. And again, you had that mix of upper class and lower class. Okay, so by the time Boxcar Iva instills her iron discipline, like we talked about, getting up at 5 a.m. and drilling and all that stuff, that number 1,000 is going to get trimmed down to about 300, I believe. Okay, so there's going to be a final cut, and then that's going to be that Women's Battalion of Death, about 300 women. Alexander Kerensky actually has a discussion with Boxcar Iva saying, hey, let's tone back the discipline a little bit. Remember, the goal is just to get women involved, and the goal is to get women out towards the battle so that they can inspire the men. And Boxcar Iva basically tells them to go stick it where the sun doesn't shine. She instills that iron discipline in her unit, and they are ready to fight. What were the results of kind of this initial formation? Well, it's interesting. At first, there was an increase in conscription. Okay, so a lot of men who previously were unable to fight due to being disabled saw this Women's Battalion of Death, and they decided they want to join the war now. So at first this was working. As sad as that might be, that Russia was in that desperate straits where they'd need disabled veterans to go back into the war and fight. That's how desperate things were. They viewed this as something they would want. You can see how both the Women's Battalion of Death and the Provisional Government were kind of using each other for their own needs at the time. One of the things that you might be thinking as you're listening to this podcast is that, what was the role of women in the unit if they were discovered? So how would men treat them? Were there any instances of sexual harassment or abuse or anything of that nature? Now, before these Women's Battalions of Death were formed, what you had was women in male units. Okay, and by and large, the male perspective on these women soldiers was, for the most part, positive. Okay, if you knew the woman in the battle. Okay, so if you were in a unit with a woman, a lot of the time the males would protect them, respect them, and not engage in any sort of abusive activity. But if you were a soldier in a neighboring unit or a unit further down the road, a lot of times the abuse, the jeering, and the increase in hostility would be there. Okay, so it's kind of like modern day internet culture, right? Where if you actually have to have a face-to-face conversation with someone, you're much more polite, you're more likely to empathize with them, respect them, you can see what they're contributing to the unit, and you can respect it, and you can, work with it. But if you're anonymously posting on Twitter, then all of a sudden, that barrier is gone and you can just say whatever the heck you want, and it's going to be a lot more negative. Okay, so the same reason internet comment forums are so ridiculously hostile. That rule is going to hold true for most of the war. Most of the men who see these women in battle, in particular the Women's Battalion of Death, they're going to respect the units. They're going to respect the women they're fighting. But as the war drags on, okay, the men who are not seeing the woman on a daily basis are actually not going to be inspired. So this propaganda technique is ultimately going to fail, which we'll get to at the end of the episode. But in general, if you were a man and you were observing, you had positive things to say about these women's units, and in particular, Women's Battalion of Death. Now, that being said, public opinion on the home front was a bit more dynamic, a bit more interesting. So, in general, it broke up into two camps. Okay, the first was the Provisional Government and supporters of the Provisional Government, and the second was the Bolsheviks and supporters of the Bolsheviks. So, if you supported the Provisional Government, chances were you were probably in that pro-war camp because the Provisional Government wanted to be back in the war. This was seen as a way to help people get back in the war, help generate enthusiasm, help men get more involved, and women get more involved. So that was a positive thing. So if you supported the war, in general, you supported these members of the Women's Battalion of Death. If you were a Bolshevik, the Bolsheviks actually did not support this movement because they wanted to get the heck out of the war. Okay, that was basically one of the number one factors in the Bolshevik platform was they wanted to get out of the war. So if you supported the Bolsheviks, you did not support these Women's Battalions of Death. In general, there was some mixing between classes. Upper classes typically supported the idea more than lower classes, believe it or not. But in general, things fell in those two categories where you were for the war or you were against the war. And based on that, you were for women soldiers or against them. Okay, and even if you were for women soldiers, that didn't mean you were necessarily for them 100% of the time. Okay, they were only, a large chunk were only supporting this because it was such a desperate time, and all hands, as I say, needed to be on deck. Regardless of what people thought at first about, these Women's Battalion of Death, the ultimate litmus test was going to be, how did the woman perform in battle? In the summer of 1917, that litmus test is going to happen, and it's called the Battle of Novus Forest. Okay, so at this battle, the Russian Women's Battalion of Death, led by Maria Boxcar Iva, okay, they finally get their, quote-unquote baptism of fire. Okay, they finally get their opportunity to prove that they are soldiers and kind of show the world what they can do, for better or for worse. Now, what ends up happening in this battle is actually pretty interesting. So they get to the trenches, right? And it's the early morning, and the Russians, the high command issues the order to attack. All right. And at first, nobody moves. Nobody does anything, and there's no charge. So after a bit of hesitation and a little bit of uncertainty, the first people over the trenches and into no man's land are actually the Russian Women's Battalion of Death. So they charge into the German trenches, okay, and they capture the first line of trenches. Okay, they take German POWs. Then they charge into the second line of trenches. They capture more Germans. They secure the trenches along with other male units. Okay, and by all accounts, the woman fought bravely, violently, and effectively. When the German POWs were being captured, a lot of them were seen to have said things like, oh, holy smokes, I was captured by a woman, and kind of hang their heads in shame. So the Germans on the other side, when they realized what was happening, had even, these Women's Battalions of Death had an impact on them, which is interesting. According to Laurie Stoff, who's the historian who wrote that book, it's called They Fought for the Motherland, and it's a book that I've used a lot in this podcast, and it's definitely a good book. You should go check it out. According to her, what happened was after they captured that second German trench, then the men and those surrounding units started drinking the alcohol that the Germans had left behind. Now, some people thought that the Germans left behind this alcohol as a way to get the Russians drunk, and then once they got drunk, they'd recapture the trench. Whether or not that's the case is up for debate. Okay, but according to Stoff, these men in the units took the alcohol, took the bait, got drunk, and then once they were drunk later on the night, the Germans went back, recaptured their lines of trenches, and the Russians retreated. Okay, that includes the Women's Battalion of Death, who fought bravely in retreat, did not take part in the alcohol abuse, and got back to where their original line of trenches were. Now, whether or not I believe that story is up for debate, I'm not sure I do. A lot of these battles in World War I, if you look at them, they kind of go like this, where one side is able to muster enough firepower and energy to capture the first line or maybe the first two lines of trenches, and then ultimately the attack kind of runs out of steam. They can't continue penetrating forward. They can't continue breaking the defenses, and then they're forced into a retreat because they are unable to kind of set up their own defenses at that new trench. So that seems to be the way a lot of battles go. I don't know if the role of alcohol was significant or not, but regardless, the Women's Battalion of Death, fought effectively. They fought bravely. Okay, the men around them saw it, and they all reported back that this was a successful fighting mission for the Russian Women's Battalion of Death. Unfortunately for the Provisional Government, this was not successful, and the reason why was because the Russian men ended up retreating. Okay, so the whole point of that Women's Battalion of Death from the government perspective was, we want to inspire these women. We want them to achieve a little bit more. We want to inspire the men. And if they're retreating, then we're not inspiring them. So the higher-ups in the government actually viewed this offensive as a failure for the Women's Battalion of Death, even though they fought bravely and just as effectively as the men who were there at the battle. So Boxcar Iva and her Women's Battalion of Death are going to continue fighting at the battle line. They're going to continue to be at the trenches, but while all that's going on for them, okay, there's chaos going on back in Petrograd, back at the Russian capital. This is around November of 1917, and what you started to see was that the success of the Women's Battalion of Death led to the formation of other women's battalions. Okay, and one of these women's battalions was the 1st Petrograd Women's Battalion. Okay, very similar name, very similar idea to what was being accomplished with the Russian Women's Battalion of Death. Okay, but this particular unit was not as strict on the discipline. They didn't have Boxcar Iva drilling them at 5 a.m. They didn't have all the crazy ideas that she had about women being forced into these masculine roles. It was still a military unit and strict, still harsh, but it was not as harsh as what Boxcar Iva was doing. Now, this unit was stationed in Petrograd, which is unfortunately for them going to be the center of the Russian Revolution in 1917 in November. The Bolsheviks basically execute a coup d'etat. They take control of the Provisional Government, and from here on out, after they continue fighting a civil war and win it, we're going to have the Soviet Union led by these Bolsheviks who came to power during this time. So what ended up happening in Petrograd was that the Bolsheviks were taking over key government buildings. Okay, building by building, they were going in an incredible feat of organization and skill from a political maneuvering perspective. They were able to capture a variety of reasons, and eventually they get to this Winter Palace where a lot of key provisional government officials are being held. And the provisional government calls on all the troops around them in Petrograd, basically the city watch, the city guard, to come in and, protect the palace, protect them from this Bolshevik invasion. And one of the units they called is that 1st Petrograd Women's Battalion, who had just been stationed in Petrograd. And these women kind of bravely answer the call. They show up, but in a way they feel betrayed because they don't want to be firing and killing fellow Russians. The reason they signed up for this war was they wanted to sign up to go kill Germans or go kill the, as they said, the Huns, the imperialistic Huns. Okay, so the women felt betrayed and they didn't want to have to do this, but nonetheless, they maintained their loyalty to the provisional government. They were brave, and even as they were being fired upon, they continued to defend the palace. Okay, they fired back while the other units around them, most of course made of males, were retreating or just going over to the Bolsheviks and saying, "Hey, look, don't kill us. We'll join the Bolsheviks. You guys are fine. Just keep a space for us on the squad." So there's different interpretations of what happened next, but basically the women are forced to move into the palace for protection. Some call this a retreat. Some call it just a tactical move. I'm not sure it matters at that point. They were probably overpowered anyway. And the women are basically forced to surrender. They're just overpowered. There's too much firepower outside. They don't have enough, quote unquote, woman power to fight back. So what happens next is a key point of contention. So some scholars think that the Bolsheviks entered into the palace and they engaged in some abuse of the woman and possibly even rape or other horrible things. And other scholars say, no, that's not what happened. There was obviously some verbal abuse and, name calling, things of that nature, probably laughing and humiliation, but there was nothing along the lines. There's no physical evidence to indicate that there's any sort of physical violence or physical assault going on. So most historians kind of fall in that second category where there's probably a lot of shaming of the woman. Remember, a lot of the Bolsheviks did not like these women fighting in the war because they saw them as tools of that provisional government, which in a sense they were. So a lot of the Bolsheviks didn't like them anyway. Probably was a lot of name calling, but there's no real significant evidence of any sort of physical altercation. Another thing that makes it difficult to determine whether or not how this event played out is that the Bolsheviks, once they became the Soviet Union, they wiped out a lot of the records of these women's battalions because, again, they didn't really see the value in them. Now, the women are disarmed. They are removed from their combat duties, and they're basically just told to either go home or face punishment. So this Petrograd Women's Battalion and the Women's Battalion of Death is disbanded, and these women are told to basically go home, and that's essentially the end of the Russian women's military movement, at least during World War I. As these women went home after being disbanded, on the journey home, a lot of them, according to reports that largely are unverifiable, were treated very poorly. There's reports of rapes, physical assaults, humiliation, violence towards these women who were just, initially trying to serve their country and trying to help things. But now this kind of sad story has come to, its ultimate conclusion where a lot of these women, their lives were, essentially destroyed, and what they thought was going to be a great, glorious adventure, turned into a nightmare. And isn't this one of the great stories of World War I, where men, women, children, basically everyone around the world, a lot of these people went into it saying this is going to be a great, fantastic, example of us proving how mighty we are and how war needs to be fought. A lot of people were thinking that. And then once you get into the trenches, once you get into the battle, once the forces surrounding everything you do are kind of manipulating you, and once you find yourself doing things you don't want to do, then that dream turns into a nightmare. So these women were possibly subjected to physical abuse, possibly not, but they were definitely psychologically scarred, of course, from taking part in this war effort. Some of them went home, were able to live fine lives. Some of them went back to their families. Some of them were able to get new jobs supporting the war effort. Some ended up continuing to serve in the military, and some actually ended up serving in World War II. Amazingly, more than 1 million female soldiers took part in the Soviet Union's effort during World War II, so that's a whole story in itself. But the roots of that military women's movement, of course, started with this Women's Battalion of Death and Maria Boxcar Iva in Russia during World War I. Now, as we said, some women went home and were able to adjust. Some were not able to adjust. Here's Lori Stoff talking about one of those women who was not able to adjust to the home life. Quote, "One volunteer committed suicide, but according to all observers and investigators, she did so for personal motives and not because of mistreatment or abuse. She took her own life in desperation after her family disowned her for joining the battalion. She had nowhere left to turn, so she tied a rope to the trigger of her rifle, loaded it with a cartridge she had kept as a souvenir from the defense of the Winter Palace, aimed the barrel at her heart, and shot herself." End quote. So as you can see, the impacts of this Women's Battalion of Death from the human element, the human emotion of the time, were far-reaching. Maria Boxcar Iva, leader of the Women's Battalion of Death, called this, quote, a pitiful finale to a heroic chapter in the history of Russian womanhood, end quote. So what started out with great patriotism and heroism and, dreams of improving your situation and going on an adventure for a lot of these women, turned into a nightmare. So what does it all mean for this particular story now that we've kind of come to the end? Was the Women's Battalion of Death and this Russian women's military movement during World War I, was it a success? It's tough to say. If you look at it strictly based on what was the intent of these women's units, then they were failures. The intent for the Provisional Government and the intent for a lot of the journalists and the people in power who were kind of manipulating the agenda, the public agenda, was we want to get these women involved so that they can inspire Russia and inspire the men to be more patriotic and fight more effectively. The Women's Battalions of Death did not do this. Once again, all the men who saw what they were doing and had firsthand accounts and were able to observe what they were doing, thought very highly of these women's units. But by and large, by the end of 1917, I think just most of the Russian males and just general public just wanted out of this war. And you see that with that Bolshevik Revolution in November. The Women's Battalions of Death, the women's battalions in general, were not able to inspire Russia to continue being in the war, and eventually Russia bows out and kind of signs a deal with Germany, and they're done with World War I. The Bolsheviks have taken over, and we're on with the Soviet Union. Now, what is the legacy of this movement in Russia? Well, as we mentioned earlier, there's a huge amount of women who take part in military operations during World War II. So I think the number is close to 1 million women are going to fight for the Soviet Union in World War II, which is absolutely incredible. Another legacy of this movement is the Russian Women's Battalion of Death is the first unit of all fully integrated female unit. So it's the first unit in military history that, at least I know of, or at least the people I've read know of a unit specifically designed for woman by woman and led by women to go into combat by themselves. Obviously there's been women soldiers who partake in battles, but this was the first time a women's unit was officially, created. As far as the women who actually fought in the war, the Women's Battalion of Death in particular, what was their fate? We heard some went home. We heard some committed suicide. We heard, a variety of different things earlier, but for the most part, it's unknown. A lot of these women didn't keep records. A lot of these records were wiped out by the Soviet Union anyway. We do know that many immigrated to other countries. Many went back to their families, started families. We do know of some who ended up fighting in the Russian Civil War and World War II. And we do know of about, a pretty large number who actually fought in that Russian Civil War between the Red Army and the White Army. What happened to Maria Boxcar Iva? Well, that kind of brings us full circle in our story. So Trotsky and Lenin actually kind of do a little political flip. Remember, we had said the Bolsheviks didn't support Boxcar Iva and the Women's Battalion of Death, but they're savvy politicians, and they know that if used correctly, this Boxcar Iva woman can have an impact on public opinion, and if they get her on their side, it can be beneficial for them. So they try and meet with Boxcar Iva. They do meet. She ends up refusing to join in typical Boxcar Iva fashion. She's going to do things her way, or she's not going to do them at all. So this upsets the Bolsheviks. She nearly gets executed then. She runs for her life. She emigrates to America, a couple other countries. While she's staying in America, she actually meets with President Woodrow Wilson, and she tells him of the plight of these women soldiers, the plight of women in Russia, the general terrible situation that's going on there. Okay, and apparently this meeting was very emotional. It's very heated. Both sides ended up crying. Boxcar Iva apparently pleaded with Wilson to send aid to Russia, send help to prevent the Bolsheviks from taking power. And, of course, Wilson did a little bit of that, but that's a story for another tale. So Boxcar Iva ends up coming back to Russia. She tries to join various army groups. A lot of the people in charge refuse her. Eventually, as she's trying to recruit herself into one of these armies, fighting against the Bolsheviks, she's captured by the Bolshevik army. She's interrogated again for 4 months, and she is ultimately executed. A pitiful finale to a heroic chapter in the history of Russian womanhood, indeed. If you like this episode of the podcast, or any of the previous episodes, you can leave a rating or review on whatever platform you're listening to it on. I'm told this helps spread the podcast to people who might be interested in listening to it somehow. So that would be fantastic if you could do that. If you didn't like the episode, you can leave me an angry tweet and we can talk about why it was terrible. Ultimately, I'm just glad you're out there listening. So that being said, thanks for listening.